myself, Tim, and you've also got Lachlan.
Howdy.
And Ruben.
Hey,
Beverage of choice. I'm going to let Ruben go first this evening. I think you're just pouring your drink. What have you got there?
Yeah, I'm halfway through pouring it. Vickers London Dry Gin.
Ooh, Vickers London Dry Gin.
Yeah.
The
That
Vickers
was cheap
Gin.
from Aldi.
Fair enough.
That's good.
How about you, Lachlan?
Yeah, I've got something a little different. Gin and tonic. But it's a Italian grapefruit, and it's actually super duper smooth. It's called Malfi, and it's really, really nice.
Okay.
It hasn't got like that grapefruit sharpness, or no? It's
It goes like perfectly with the tonic water. It's pretty good, nice and fresh.
Nice, very good.
What about you, big man?
Once again, I mean, what was the name of that pirate in Pirates of the Caribbean that sailed the ship that goes underwater and stuff?
Jack Sparrow or the other guy?
No, I don't know. Release the Kraken. That's what I'm drinking.
Yeah.
That's not the liter bottle, is it?
No, it's not the liter bottle. If it was, I'd be in trouble. That's the old bottle, which is, for those listening, is almost empty.
Too funny.
Yeah,
You have people like listening in podcast land, like yelling the name of that ship's captain, which none of us can think of. I know who you mean, Octopus Face.
That's the guy.
Yeah.
Yep, that's the guy.
Davy Jones.
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
How did we not know that?
I know.
Well, it's been a while, and I think the last few times I've heard the Pirates of the Caribbean sort of storylines, it's been through playing Sea of Thieves. So, which the first... Oh, did you guys play that? That first chapter was painful.
I started playing it and I thought, this thing's massive, and I didn't sink the time into it.
Did you do that first quest?
Yeah, it was a bit boring. I liked the music though. The atmosphere was quite great, but that was about all I could say for it.
Yeah, I found and then remember we tried to do the second one, Ruben, with the girls one night, and we bugged it somehow, and it was like,
Couldn't finish it.
We turn it off or we play for another hour just to get back up to where we were up to.
Yeah, and that was about the end of it.
Yeah, that was a hard pass after that. Anyway, back to what matters. So we did Plato's Cave last week. That was heaps of fun. I've had a few conversations about it through the week and sort of spent some time just chewing on that a bit more. Have either of you guys thought about that much this week?
Off and on, sort of popped up. Yeah, it's I think just because it's one of those texts that people sort of hold up on that sort of pedestal, so it always bears, I think, a bit more sort of thought as you go.
How about you, Ruben?
Yeah, man, totally. I've really been chewing on that idea of the particular, being obsessed with the particular versus the actual reality that's above that. But there's a passage in this week's text that made me think, oh, hang on, maybe I should dial it back a bit. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about.
Ooh.
So we'll get to that.
Are you starting to take the Socratic way out of just, I don't really know what I'm talking about?
No, not exactly.
Anyway, right? That's what you do.
Oh, yeah, maybe that's the right way. All right, well, let's do a recap of last week. Who's going to do that?
You know what, Rubes? I reckon you should do the cave because you did it really well the last week.
Right.
Well, I can do it, and then you can.
I'll wing it. I'll do it.
Yeah. Well, we did a quick summary, right? So it was prisoners inside a cave, chained up, where they could only see the back wall of the cave, right? Behind them was like a walkway where people could walk past, and further back still was a fire, and the fire would illuminate objects that people were carrying on their heads on this walkway behind the prisoners, and the shadows of that would play on the wall in front of the prisoners. So the prisoners' reality, because they couldn't turn their heads and couldn't see or understand anything, their reality was the shadows that they could see on the wall, and they would play a game to sort of guess what shadow was coming up next. And that was kind of like how they would sort of, I don't know, pat each other on the back and have hierarchy and status in their world. At some point in time, one of the prisoners escapes and turns around and makes his way, or was he escaped or is he made to look that way? I can't quite remember what the deal was. And he sort of heads up out of the cave and sort of brought into the light, I guess. And it stings his eyes, and he can't even look up to sort of see the sun or anything like that because he spent his whole life in the cave, right? And as he's sort of like looking at reflections of, because he can't even, see things in the full brightness, he's just like looking at the reflections. And even from seeing the reflections, he can realize that his reality that he knew in the cave was a fallacy, and it's ridiculous. And I think at some point in time, they're sort of saying he gets his face sort of held into the light, even though it's sort of painful, and then he can sort of eventually, his eyes can start to adjust, and he may be able to sort of see, the sun for, all its glory and its truth and its whole form, rather than being reflected or, seeing other sort of representations or images, but seeing the true form, which is, goodness in this story. And then he has to sort of return down from basking in the light of goodness to return to the cave, and tells his fellow prisoners about what he's seen. And they all think he's mad. And because once he's returned, his eyes are used to the brightness now. He can't even sort of determine what the shadows are on the walls, because, his eyes aren't used to the darkness anymore. So he can't even see the old reality now that he's seen the new reality. And the other prisoners are so shocked by all this anyway that, they'll threaten to kill him if they're going to, if he's going to try and free them to show them the real reality, or his version of reality. Was that about it, boys?
Yeah, nailed it.
That's pretty good.
Probably took too long.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I would just add that within that analogy, the idea is there's different levels of knowledge. Inside the cave, the shadows are essentially the material world, and the particulars, i.e., looking at a dog or a tree or whatever. So just what the senses can give you, like hearing and sight and taste and smell. And then the fire that casts those shadows is supposed to be the sun. So everything inside the cave is material reality, and then outside the cave, in Plato's system of thought, is essentially what you would call ultimate reality, the real truth of things. So what you see in the cave are just reflections or ideas that come from the actual forms which exist outside the cave.
Yeah, and I think even outside the cave, they talk about, to start with, you can only look at the reflections of things. So it's all sort of like giving you that impression of the journey to enlightenment. And
big time. Yeah, that's a good point.
And so you can't just sort of step out of the cave and have it. It's still a process and something you're sort of working through. So to start with, it's so bright out there. All you can do is look at the reflections in like some water or something, rather than looking at the real sun and all its glory.
Yeah,
so to
and
speak.
it's in the context of Plato trying to explain why philosophers are the best and why they should rule everything.
That's it.
So the idea being that the person who should rule society should be the one that understands truth in its highest form, I guess, is kind of the best way to see it. Which is why he explains that sometimes people go back into the cave, they've seen the truth, they come back into the cave, and they can't function. People think they don't function well in society. They think they think there's something wrong with them, and as Lachlan pointed out, sometimes they basically threaten to kill them because they don't really fit in. Which is a long-winded explanation from Plato and from Socrates why people don't like him. No, not only why they don't like him, but why the so-called philosophers of his philosophy has sort of come into disrepute in his day, and that was his explanation for why. It's a really multi-layered analogy that explains a whole bunch of different things.
Yep.
And in addition to that, after the cave, we talked about some math stuff with some funny finger examples that he was giving us about
Yeah,
So
so that's right.
three
He
things.
hooks into like, well, now I've given you my analogy, and we agree that philosophers should be the kings, and now we're going to talk about what kind of education they should undergo. And he said the first thing he came up with math, and then I think what we hook into now for the reading this week is the other things that he says should be part of their education.
Yeah, so
Which is good, because I remember a while back when we went through the book earlier, they were talking about all these tests, like how you could know who's going to be the leader. They have to undergo all these tests. Well, this section is kind of explaining how that sort of functions.
It also just sort of shows the long game that Socrates sort of plays, because he thought about all this stuff, and it's just teasing it out of him. I should say, just before we continue too, like the deal with the maths was that they sort of ascertained that the guardians need to be a combination of sort of like warrior and philosopher, and that the study of arithmetic, because I should be specific, it wasn't maths, it was arithmetic, is going to help you to like arrange your troops in war, as well as encourage your intelligence to seek truth. So it was to have those two sort of benefits they were talking about. And that the idea is that by having this sort of baseline education about this science that wants you to sort of seek truth, that'll be sort of like a parallel for your learning in philosophy, and that you'll look to seek truth in philosophy, because that's how you've been sort of programmed with your education anyway. And I think the link there was that because math involves some where it's like abstract and intangible kind of things, and so that's a concept obviously that's common in philosophy. So rather than looking at those fingers that are in front of you, you're sort of maybe thinking outside the box about some other possibilities. Maybe we don't even have fingers. Maybe they're tentacles. I don't know.
Well, in his epistemology, or his system of thought, that's like the next step up in knowledge.
Yeah,
it's like you have two coconuts, but the truth of that idea is the concept of two, which is above the material coconuts. I like coconuts.
And is a coconut even a nut? The answer is no.
Exactly
right. So this week we sort of moved on from there, right? Well, we sort of moved on and then backwards, because we're still talking about maths, aren't we?
Well, Socrates actually does that. There's a point here where we won't go into that much detail, but I think he goes, what does he do? He goes maths, or he goes arithmetic, geometry, music or something, and he goes, oh, wait, we missed something in geometry, and he goes back to geometry. Anyway, it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah. I mean, he pulls back into geometry, which is kind of funny, but as we're talking about, I think it's kind of hard for us to imagine, because the kind of math they're talking about in here is the stuff that kids do in primary school now. I guess we take it for granted, like where that knowledge maybe came from. And, we're talking about here, finding the area or volume of cubes and things like that is what he's kind of talking about. And that's like kind of cutting edge math at this point in time. So it's interesting to sort of hear them talking about this stuff. Just in our modern context, it's just something we take for granted now, I think. But I think basically the idea is that, with the math stuff too, it's about, I think you make some comment there about people who are good at maths are just generally intelligent and, quick to pick up other bits of learning and all that sort of thing. And that's why they wanted to kind of throw that into the curriculum. But I wasn't quite sure, because, they were kind of putting that framework around it that, the point of putting this stuff in here was that it was going to sort of always have that purpose of drawing you towards, truth and the eye of the soul and all this sort of thing. But I wasn't quite sure how geometry was going to get them there.
I think it's a double. Well, particularly with arithmetic, I think they see it as a double purpose. They're like,
sure,
it will foster the mind, but it will also sort the men from the boys, so to speak. So the leaders can look and go, all right, well, that guy can't even count to 10. He's out. That sort of stuff. They could sort of start to see. And then when they go into geometry, it's a similar sort of thing. But I agree. I got a bit lost on the geometry bit, and they talk about solid geometry versus
it was kind of like
plane geometry and solid geometry, which I think essentially is like like a dumb way to say it would be like 2D geometry like you have on a paper versus 3D geometry, as in
Yep.
3D objects, spheres, and volume and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Like
I've got
I kind of think. Oh yeah, go for it. I was going to say, at any rate, it kind of just seems like they sort of say, yeah, that's similarly good for the same reasons that maths is, and we should work that in there. But sorry, you were about to say something.
Look, I just grabbed a little snapshot from what they had there, and I guess that might sort of sum up what they're talking about there.
Go.
That the knowledge at which geometry aims is knowledge of the eternal and not of aught perishing and transient. So not stuff that's going to, pass on by. So just the eternal. That, he replied, may be readily allowed and is true. Then, my noble friend, geometry will draw the soul towards truth and create the spirit of philosophy and raise up that which is now unhappily allowed to fall down. Nothing will be more likely to have such an effect. Then nothing should be more sternly laid down than that the inhabitants of your fair city should by all means learn geometry. Moreover, the science has indirect effects which are not small. So I'm not quite sure why this is so important, but anyway, they seem to be pretty passionate about the fact that geometry is key to this. So,
Once again,
I think
it's coming
these
back to
days
the whole...
wouldn't it be a case of like someone saying that physics is king? Like maybe at their point in time, it was the hierarchy of math, and at the top, of the hierarchy of math,
like cutting edge for their time.
Yeah, so like now it might be quantum physics.
I think so, but
whatever.
I think for that to work as like a direct analogy, he would basically be saying physics is important because it doesn't just look at a rock falling, it looks at the principles behind the rock falling. Those principles don't change, therefore they're eternal, as opposed to the rock itself, which is just a particular.
With that, and then it's also because that's sort of hard to sort of like, it's something that you would have to think about. You know what I mean? You can't just observe it and know it's true. Yeah,
you got to be capable of that higher order thinking. Yeah. Fair enough. Anyway. All right, so arithmetic and geometry are on the list.
Tick.
Yes, and then they move on to astronomy. Is that right?
Which is funny. This is funny as hell, actually.
Yeah. So I like this part. So Glaucon's like, oh yeah, astronomy, that's king, and it makes you look up. And Socrates is like, no, it makes you look down. Because I think that's really funny. I think I've got a signed thing here of you can see it up in the back corner there of Brian Cox. I've got.
Actually, this is interesting. I'm glad you're bringing this up. I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say here, because this occurred to me as well. Go.
So he's famous for looking up in the sky and staring off with a boyish look on his face, because that's like the story of our life is found in the stars, and it's like the highest thing scientifically that they're looking for, and I think Plato is like, no, I mean it's still just. You're still just looking at the pencil, or the object. You're not actually thinking about the principles behind it. And I think that's kind of right. Like in that, so like obviously Professor Brian Cox does look at the physics behind the stars.
Yeah.
But he gets his joy from observing the stars, not just from the principles of what controls those stars and how those stars were formed. And I think Glaucon doesn't make that distinction. He's like, oh, if you look up at the stars, that's what you're talking about. That's the highest level. And he's like, no, you still don't get it. It's what's behind them. It's the laws that apply to those stars and to the heavens.
Well, I actually think Socrates is saying that there's another level above that. But
I think so. But I think he's like, what was the example we were saying before of like the physical objects? Like of the model car.
The particular.
I think like this model car, the example we used the other day. I think Socrates is saying that the entire heavens is the same as a car. Like that, it's still just the physical. It's not actually.
Yeah, exactly.
The things behind the physical.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's sort of like I think Glaucon's sort of trying to tie it into the fact that just by looking heavenwards as well, it's kind of a spiritual thing and naturally sort of linked in with philosophy because it's prompting deeper thought or something like that. Which it's just funny that Socrates is kind of like hanging a bit of shit on him because it's actually Socrates who brought it up, and then he just kind of smashes Glaucon on it. But
well, that's very interesting because there's a really, really famous painting called The School of Athens, and the two central figures within that painting is supposed to be Plato and Aristotle, or it might be Socrates and Aristotle. At any rate, and in the painting, you've got Plato looking up and pointing to the sky, and you've got Aristotle next to him pointing down and arguing, and apparently that's supposed to be like a really profound explanation of their two philosophies because, you know, Plato was very much like you can't just look at the physical world and there's something above it, whereas Aristotle apparently brought it a lot more back down to earth.
Is that the one that was done by Raphael? Is that the one you mean?
It's done by someone.
I have a wallpaper
I think
at the moment.
I'll look it up.
I think I actually have that as my wallpaper on my computer. I'll see if I can share
it's a fresco by Raphael. It was painted in 1509 and between 1509 and 1511. It's in the Vatican somewhere. The room's now known as Stanze de Raffaello.
All right.
Was that good pronunciation?
Not bad, man. Not bad.
Yeah, so that's them two. Anyone that's watching, it's them two dudes in the middle.
Yeah.
I wonder if it'll tell us if it's the central figures are supposed to be. I'm guessing it's Plato and the central figures are Plato and Aristotle. Yeah, that's it.
There you go. Nice one. But so I think like more or less you've got Socrates says that basically if you're just using your eyes to look at it, you're doing it wrong. This is basically what he kind of gets down to. It's interesting, because I think he's just talking about more about understanding the movement and the sort of science behind it, rather than just kind of like looking at the stars and the moon and all that sort of stuff, and I don't know, being able to tell when you should plant your crops or something.
He's like, that's all good and well, but that's not the highest level of knowledge according to him.
Just a side note too. When I was showing you guys that screenshot, which I'll do again right now, I was like talking myself up, like, oh, look at that, I did that on the fly, and how cool is that? And I was muted the whole time. So, go my podcasting skills.
Technical powerhouse.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, I'm all over this, and then they can't hear me.
But you did just throw in an image without doing it in post production, so that's
impressive. I was pretty happy with that. Pretty happy.
Not bad.
It beats holding up a model car to the camera.
Sure.
Oh well, hang on. What's wrong with holding up this fine replica yellow Triumph Stag, 1973 Stag?
There you go.
It's beautiful. I miss that car, by the way.
Okay, James Bond drove one in Diamonds Are Forever, so it can't be too bad, right?
Yeah. I don't know if his car selection's always the best benchmark, but it's all good. There's been some doozies in there.
Yeah, for sure.
So anyway, they basically call out, what about the stars? And then they bag out the stars, and then they go, yeah, but then they should still study the stars.
Yep.
You're right. It is pretty funny that Glaucon's like, yeah, I got this, and Plato's just like, Socrates is just like, nah.
I mean, he does actually sort of point out the fact that Glaucon's view is pretty commonly held, and that Socrates is sort of trying to be somewhat humble about it, but it's a bit of a humble brag. It's like, most people think that, but maybe this is actually what it should be about.
I still like the fact that Socrates obviously realizes that people are going to hate him no matter how he sells this shit.
Yeah, but it is something that does trigger the mind looking up at the stars.
I agree. Yeah,
and a lot of the things that I've read have been inspired by that, and a lot of the sci-fi that we enjoy is inspired by those ideas, and it's Yeah, it definitely
Well,
is magnificent to look at. That's for sure.
agreed.
which
Yeah,
he doesn't
I've got a
deny.
question. I got a. Sorry, go.
Oh, I was just saying, which he doesn't deny.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like
What's your
Socrates sort of says, yeah, looking up at the spangled sky, it's beautiful. Yeah, absolutely.
what's your
I have
question,
a.
Ruben?
I have a question. I don't know how interesting, whether you find this as interesting as I do, but what do you think Socrates' response would be to a modern day physicist who looks up at the sky with that awe and then
Mm.
says, that star is made up of these chemicals and these compounds, and I know that because X, Y, Z, and isn't that amazing?
That's a great
What do you what
question.
do you what do you think Socrates' response would be? That would it be the same as his response was to Glaucon?
I don't know. I mean, he is sort of he's somebody who does appreciate science and maths, right, and intelligence. And I think he may well sort of say there is a physical element or something like that. I mean, he may well have some barb about there being more to it than perhaps what you mere mortal can perceive or something. But I'm sure just quietly, like he sort of talks about the um, Pythagorean mathematicians or something with some respect. I'm sure he'd have respect for it as well, right?
Do you think he'd ask questions? So, for example, let's just play this out a little bit. So, Ruben, you're saying we know that it's this star because, and it's made of these um, materials. So I think he'll go, oh, how do you know it's made? Like, so let's just say, let's pick a thing. Let's say, oh no, what's a thing?
It's an asteroid.
No, but let's like, what's it made out of?
Yeah, it's
I don't know,
iron.
helium.
Iron.
It's a helium star or something.
All right, so okay, so then you go, oh, how do you know it's helium? And you'd say, well, helium burns this color. Do you think he wouldn't ask, well, is it possible that something else could also burn that color? Do you think that'd
No,
be
I
his line of questioning, and they'd be, and their answer might be, well, that's the only thing that burns that color, and you'd be, but maybe there's something over there that hasn't been here yet, which we don't know. So how do you know it's that? Like maybe it's something else that burns the same color.
I think
Do
he
you think
would
he'd pull it apart like that,
almost.
or
I think he would almost certainly ask those questions, but I think when you look at the cave analogy, I think he would still be basically saying, "Yeah, that's amazing, but you're still just looking at shadows on the wall.
Mm. Well, that's
No
just
matter
like
how well you
your
can."
opinion, man.
but where are you
But
going with the shadows on the wall?
so in the analogy, you've got the shadows on the wall, and everything inside the cave is the physical universe. So no matter how good they get at describing the shadows, and even if they stand up and turn around and see the fire and see what's causing the shadows, they still don't see the ultimate reality that's outside the cave, because in his analogy, inside the cave is physical reality, the physical world. So it's still
Mm.
all just particulars. So I've got a way to expand the question. What do you think he would say to Carl Sagan? Um, he wrote he's a famous atheist, and he wrote some bunch of famous books. But one of his major quotes is, "We're all made of stardust." I'm curious what Plato and Socrates' stance would be on that kind of idea.
Hmm.
I'm wondering if he'd be critical of it, whether he'd be saying, you can describe what we're made of as much as you want, mate, but that's not the highest order of reality, because it still doesn't tell you what the form is, what the unchangeable form of a thing is.
It's kind of hard though because you can argue that almost for anything though, right? Because if you can dispel any physical evidence or whatever by just sort of saying, well, it's in the physical world, talk to me about um, the real reality, which is unobservable. Um, how do you do that? You know what I mean? I mean, only through the path of enlightenment, as I think Socrates sort of says further on.
Yeah,
Unless you've been through all these studies, there's no point in me talking about it because you wouldn't recognize it anyway, pleb. So I don't know. It's kind of a hard thing because you're kind of in a no-win situation because it's how are you ever going to be able to describe anything then? You know, but I guess that's the problem, right? Because you're in the physical world, yeah. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
and I think,
you're right.
and it comes up later in what we've read tonight. Like, there's an idea. He does. He starts. Maybe I'll wait till we get to that point.
But there's a I think you're onto something, Lachlan. There's a compatibility issue with his hierarchical system and that of the physicist. So the what can I say? The Brian Cox of the world would argue that the laws of physics is the top.
The highest order knowledge. Yeah.
And then from that, all things are formed, and all things come into being, and all things have their place, and etc. etc. So his system has no scope for going beyond that level. Whereas
You mean Brian Cox? So the physicist system in that,
yeah, it doesn't have
has no scope. Yeah.
Maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but I feel
No, you're not. I think that's perfect. I think I'm tracking with what you're saying.
yeah, I think the system that they apply, or the scientific system that they apply, has no scope to go outside of the senses because it's built on the senses.
maybe, but maybe like when he was talking about, I think like astronomy and stuff in general, and he's saying, I mean, there's still some level of observation here because he's talking about trying to understand the movements and the perhaps like harmony of the universe and stuff in that how it interreacts and all that sort of thing. So there's still, even with his explanation, he's still sort of talking like partly about observation, right? But it's like he's sort of pointing out that there's stuff even that is going to be happening that maybe you can't observe, right? You're not going to be able to see with your eyes. And in some senses, he's right. And if you talk to somebody maybe like a Brian Cox or someone, like they've found things like black holes, which were a theoretical thing which couldn't be observed, but it's been proven in that they do exist, but at a time previously, like they couldn't be observed and understood in that sort of sense. But still, there was like theory, which is probably that higher level that he's maybe talking about, and that's where it's kind of linking that higher level of maths and science into that higher level of understanding and soul searching. I mean, I don't know if I'm drawing the right conclusions.
No, I follow you. Like another example is the God particle that got predicted. It took them a long time before they found it. So absolutely, I follow. I just wonder if Socrates would just continue though to keep saying that that's still the physical. It's still the physical. It's still the physical. What's beyond the physical? Yeah. And
I suspect he would.
But then is the answer physics? Is the answer that the Brian Cox would say? Well, the theories that we have are what you're searching for, because the theories describe the force behind these physical things happening.
Yeah, the unobservable.
Yeah, see, I suspect, and it's all speculation, I guess, but I suspect that Socrates' position would be no, that's still just the physical. There is something above that, and I think Lachlan hit on it earlier. The question then is, well, okay, maybe there is something beyond that, but I mean, we're dealing with things that we can observe. These is empirical things. You're talking about something that we can't observe empirically. How do we really know there is that higher level, that higher order knowledge? We're just relying on what you're telling. And in fact, in this story, in the dialogue, he then goes on with Glaucon, what I was referring to just a moment ago, and Glaucon goes, because they get to the section of dialectic, which so they go through what is it? They're going to go on for after astronomy. They go into harmony, whatever, and then he basically says, so once they've done all this training, there's a higher level technique, and it's called dialectic. And then Glaucon says, "Oh, that's amazing. Tell me how this dialectic work." And Socrates just goes, "You can't follow me there, man."
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
like he's not because I'm unwilling, but it would take longer than it would take longer than what we've already discussed. It'd take another 10 books or whatever, maybe 20.
Yeah.
And then the question at that point is then, all right, so at this point, you're talking about some esoteric knowledge that you've got access to because you've allegedly been outside the cave. Why am I even listening to you?
Mm.
And that's kind of what I'm getting at. That's the question. It's like, yeah, all right, we've got all this empirical knowledge. It's pretty solid. It's really good. It's got great predictive power. There might be something above that, but I mean, how do you know? And why
Well,
do we care?
but the allegory of the cave would show that you wouldn't believe it anyway, even if someone showed it to you.
Yeah, isn't that kind of a catch-22 though? It's almost like a
Totally.
catch-22, or almost like a. It's almost, and when you consider that Socrates is sitting there trying to explain that people like him should be ruling society, it's starting to sound almost like the really negative way to look at it is it's like basically like a cop out. He's like saying, no, you got to let people like me rule society because we see the real truth, and you can't see the truth, and no matter what I tell you, you won't see the truth. So just do as I tell. Like
It's it, it's very
that's the
much like that. I mean, I
uncharitable
don't
way
think
to
he's
look at it.
yeah. Look, I don't think he's telling you to suck it, but like he sort of is. I guess like yeah, that's exactly what he's doing though. Like he is sort of saying that you're not going to be able to understand this, but these people that we can show the light to will understand it, and they're the only ones who are capable of leading us. They won't be able to tell you why though, but they've seen
And no matter what,
they've seen more. They've seen things, man, and you just can't get your head around it. So you're just gonna have to trust me. Just hand
yeah, it
over the
really is
reins.
just like it's really this kind of esotericism.
Yeah.
Look, personally, truth be told, I'm actually on Socrates' side here. I
Mm.
agree with him. I think there is that higher level reality, but the way he's presented it at this point in history, in this dialogue, I think there are reasonable questions as to the validity of what he's explaining.
Well, no, and I think the thing is too that he's saying you can't have. There can't be. I'm not saying that there should be multiple realities, but what he's saying is like our reality is wrong, and the higher reality is right, and that's not necessarily something you'd agree with because okay, whilst you might sort of say that the eyes and the senses might tell a lie, so to speak, um, at the same time, I think maybe in our more modern world, science has gotten to a degree where there are things that you can sort of lean on as being, you know, rock solid as far as empirical. Other things which are still theoretical, but I think there is still some truth in some of that. I mean, he's got kind of a foot each way because I mean, he still wants the science and all that sort of thing, but he just kind of thinks that that's the gateway to help you understand.
Yeah. But I
It's
think
above it.
I think the scientist would have a similar argument. I recall watching one of the Brian Cox documentaries where he did this experiment showing where particles fall, and they use this board that's got slots in it, and he's like,
Oh, the double slit experiment.
yeah, and he's like, it should land this way, like our minds tell us it should go through this way, but it doesn't. It does a different thing, and I think that would be like his explanation right now of there's this other understanding or not, I don't know if reality is quite the right word, but this other comprehension or whatever it is. I think scientists would probably agree with him, but they would say that that's found through the study of things such as physics, that act in a way that we don't expect, but that the scientific method then demonstrates we didn't expect it to act that way, but it acted this way, and we know that's true because it's based on the scientific method.
Yeah,
I think
but looking,
we're probably like going to really get into the weeds if we start talking about quantum physics. But I think the significance of that experiment, from my understanding, which is really limited, I'm looking at some shadows on the wall right now. is the significance of that is that it appears that reality bends to observation. So it takes observation, and then the observation affects the outcome. Anyway, sorry, you were going to say something, Lachlan. Ignore my ramblings.
No, that's all good. That's all good. I can't really remember where I was going with, but
Well,
I was
do you think this is why Socrates takes it to the example of truth to try and get Glaucon to understand? Because he moves on and says, and you would say the same of the conception of the good. So I might just read that bit. Maybe
Sure.
that helps. So, until the person is able to abstract and define rationally the idea of good, and unless he can run the gauntlet of all objections, and is ready to disprove them, not by appeals to opinion, but to absolute truth, neither faltering at any step of the argument, unless he can do all this, you would say that he knows neither the idea of good, nor any other good. He apprehends only a shadow, if anything at all, which is given by opinion and not by science. Dreaming and slumbering in this life, before he is well awake here, he arrives at the world below, and has his final quietus. I don't think I said that last word right. How do you say that? Quietus.
Is that coitus?
No, it's not coitus. It's not his final coitus.
Pretty sure it's not.
He got to the root of the problem.
Nice. Oh god.
No, you lost. I didn't really follow that quote at all.
What are you saying?
Find out my book.
Oh, I thought he was using the example of good to try and explain roughly what he was on about, in that, until you fully understand good completely by pursuing it, and being able to abstract and define rationally the idea of what good is, then you've got no chance of even recognizing or understanding what good is.
Well, because I think that was an early criticism he had in the last book or chapter or what have you that we read, where he said, if you asked somebody to define it, what were they saying? Good is truth, and they said, what is truth? Oh, truth is good, and they just had this circular sort of argument where no one actually knew what they were talking about.
Right.
And so I think he's just sort of saying, like, unless you did fully understand that, there's, what leg have you got to stand on to tell anyone what you think is good if you can't understand it all and explain it all from the get-go.
Now, I want to open a can of worms here.
Please do.
Yeah, so buckle up. So this whole thing of once you're enlightened and you come back, you get rejected by everybody. That sounds like a very New Testament idea of once you become a Christian, the world will hate you. And I know it's also an idea that's taught in other religions as well, that once you subscribe to that religious system, that those who you were amongst before will reject you because they can't understand and they don't get it. My point is, or thought is, when we read this, we think, oh, that makes sense. Does it make sense because it's true of seeking truth and philosophy, or does it make sense because when you have a substantial change in your belief system and how you see the world, and then return to where you were prior to that change, that you, generally speaking, get rejected by the larger group because of that change? Do you get what I'm trying to say?
No, I think it's just that philosophers lack charisma, because if they had charisma, they'd have a cult following them.
That's very
funny. If you think about it, like, I mean, how many cults have been formed by people who claim to have found a new truth and a new reality? Heaps. And
all of them?
Yeah, for sure. And it's just, I think that their leaders have a certain amount of charisma. And, obviously living in a falsehood, though, right? Where I suppose philosophy is trying not coming from that angle. I don't know. I guess it depends on whether those cult leaders actually believe what they're saying, or if it's just invented for fame, followers, and power, or something like that. But I don't know. Like it certainly does happen. People come up with this sort of stuff. You're not wrong though. I mean, there's going to be people who reject it, but I think I don't know. Maybe the world's big enough now that there's going to be enough people who find them and latch onto it. You know, they want the Matrix to be real, so they want to believe in something else. So,
you take the blue pill. Yeah.
Are you I don't know, but I'm just trying to understand what you're saying, Tim. Is basically what you're saying is any okay. I guess it presupposes that only very few people access these fundamental truths. So anyone who accesses this fundamental truth are essentially going to not be accepted or sort of understood by the people that they used to associate with. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Let me try and put it to words. So Socrates is describing a rejection of those who have found this new understanding of the light, so to speak. My question is, he's saying that the rejection is a result of you discovering this light and people not being able to comprehend what you're saying and finding you strange and all those types of things. But
I think I have an example. Sorry.
Hold on to it. My point is, is he's describing a reaction and applying that reaction happens because of A, but my thought is that correct, or is it just the normal reaction when someone from a tribe or someone from a culture of thinking has a massive change in their perception of their value system and their hierarchy? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, then, well, if that's, then I agree. You're right. Yeah, I think that is the natural reaction when you go against, because essentially what you're describing is going against the accepted order of things.
Yeah.
So aren't you all, you're always going to have that reaction, aren't you? Well, largely.
Well, that's my point. So I don't quite understand what he's getting at with that point, because to me it's not unique to someone who's discovered philosophy. It's the normal reaction from a tribe when someone from within the tribe decides that everything the tribe's doing and values is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, look, whenever you challenge your social norms, you're going to come up against resistance. I 100% agree with you.
Well, isn't that kind of what he's he's kind of combat? He's essentially saying, yes, you're going to have a reaction. So here's the way that you could structure society so that reaction wouldn't occur and people would live within what Socrates is saying is the truth.
Yeah, you might be right.
But he's also and he admits it sort of further on, that he's being defensive and that he's frustrated because of how the philosophers are perceived. And so, I mean, we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit here, but I mean, he's kind of slightly apologetic for the fact that he's gone so hard on this, because he's just frustrated that, you know, they're either looked at like they're lunatics or they're just useless sycophants sucking up to whoever's going to pay them the most attention or whatever it is.
Yeah, I don't think you're jumping too far ahead, because it's the next page for me, that part. So you're onto it. Anyway, it was just a thought I had. I don't know if it's particularly exciting or relevant, but it just occurred to me that I hear those stories quite often when people talk about converting to Christianity, and I just thought, well, that's the same sort of reaction. And then I thought about it a little bit more of what other examples are there outside of philosophy and Christianity, and I just thought, well, it seems to be a common reaction regardless of what new discovery you find, for people to treat you that way.
I mean, you'll find it in the business
that's
world, even if you want to go and change your company culture or
Yeah.
something. It happens, yeah, it all in all sort of different planes of human interaction, I think.
well. The example I thought of, yeah, that's actually a good point. Sorry, Lachlan, you're right. Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't worked in the business world like you, but that makes sense. But I've seen it also in my work where someone wants to change things and everyone's just like, "What are you doing? What are you doing? Change, change." um, yes, sorry. No. The example I thought of, just as I mentioned earlier, um, particularly with the Christian example, and it kind of ties into his explanation of where you go back into the cave once you've seen the light, and people don't understand you anymore. Where I've run up against that is the idea of forgiveness. Um, like I've said to people in the past where they're just like, X, Y, and Z, they've done this, and I'm really upset with them, and now I want to do this. And when you say to them, there's a way out of this, you could forgive them.
Hmm.
And like forgiveness is a very Christian concept, and people who have not considered that or are not Christian or are not in tune with that, when you say things like that to them, their response is they don't even look at you with disgust. They just look at you with a total. I've seen it with some people. I'm not talking about everyone. With some people, they look at you with like a total like sign of disbelief. So I kind of like it just
Like, where
like
did
they're
that
like,
come
what?
from?
Like, what do you
Yeah.
what do you mean you can just forgive someone? That makes no sense. And they're right. It does make no sense. And so I can kind of sort of see what you're saying, and I can sort of relate. I can sort of think maybe that's what Socrates is talking about when people have gone back into the cave. And I'm not suggesting that because I believe in forgiveness that I've been outside the cave and I'm 100% right. I'm just illustrating sometimes when you get
Yeah.
two worldviews that butt up against each other, that there's just this real divide that just sort of can't be crossed. Like it is like you're talking a different language sometimes.
Well, we just talked about work. Strangely, one of the reasons that Socrates talks about in a minute is because of people having no vocation. So they start talking about choosing the person that's going to use the dialectic, and
Yeah, you're right. He kind of wraps it up and he says, "These are your different levels of education. This is what you have to go through." And he actually gives time frames, doesn't he? Is that the bit you're talking about?
yeah, well, yeah, he does do that. But before, so we'll just say, okay.
The hymn of the
Here we go.
dialect.
So I'll read this part. Dialectic, then, as you will agree, is the coping stone of the sciences and is set over them. No other science can be placed higher. The nature of knowledge can go no further. I agree, he said. But to whom we are to assign these studies, and in what way are they to be assigned, are questions which remain to be considered. Yes, clearly. You remember, I said, how the rulers were chosen before? Certainly, he said. The same natures must still be chosen, and the preference given to the surest and the bravest, and if possible to the fairest, and, having noble and generous tempers, they should also have the natural gifts which will facilitate their education. And what are these? Such gifts as keenness and ready powers of acquisition, for the mind more often faints from the severity of study than from the severity of gymnastics. The toil is more entirely the mind's own, and is not shared with the body. Very true, he replied. Further, he of whom we are in search should have a good memory, and be unwearied, solid man, who is a lover of labour in any line, or he will never be able to endure the great amount of bodily exercise, and to go through all the intellectual discipline and study which we require of him. Certainly, he said, he must have natural gifts. The mistake at present is that those who study philosophy have no vocation, and this, as I was saying before, is the reason why she has fallen into disrepute. Her true sons should take her by the hand, and not bastards. I found that really funny. He's like, real philosophers need to have jobs.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, he sort of talks about it a little bit further on too, just about the fact that they kind of need real life experience. And maybe, that's that whole thing about balance that they're talking about sort of earlier in there about, you know, the whole thing's about having a wholeness rather than just like, focusing on one particular thing.
I've often thought over the last few months doing this show and starting to get into philosophy over the last few years, I keep thinking, man, should I be doing this? Like, I've got a job, I've got this, I've got that. But I read that today, and I was like, Socrates would agree with me having a vocation. So I can have a job and also study some philosophy. So that was my takeaway from this week. Philosophers aren't lifelong uni student bums. They have jobs.
They could be. Yeah, this is kind of the bit where they start to break down all those ages and the time spent, isn't it? So
yeah. So at 35.
Sorry, I don't mean to drag things out.
Right.
But before we sort of skipped over their idea of dialectic to actually describe what dialectic is and what it means.
All right. Do you want to read that bit out?
Well, I'll just try to summarize it.
Right,
they've kind of said after they do all these different sets of training, then they'll go to dialectic, and dialectic is supposed to be the highest way to knowledge. That's the bit we referred to earlier, where Glaucon says, "Oh, dialectic, tell me about how this works," and Socrates kind of says, "No, you can't go there, bro." But basically, what he's saying about, like, the simplest way I can think of to describe what he's talking about dialectic is that it's basically pure reason. It's like the highest and the best form of knowledge. It doesn't accept presuppositions. It doesn't accept presumptions, because it's like pure logic, pure reason, and it gets you to the real truth. And he's saying that's kind of what happens outside the cave. That's the best way I can think to describe it. I don't know whether you guys have any thoughts on that, but that's kind of where he goes with that. And that is supposed to be the final level of training that they give to these philosopher kings.
Yeah, I just looked up the definition of a dialectic, and it just basically...
sorry, I'm going to stop you there. This is going to get us into the weeds. Which definition did you look up?
Okay, let's go.
I can't remember, but it was pretty basic. And really all it just sort of said was that it was someone who is skilled in debate, but it was debate in the pursuit of truth. And it was that simple. Yeah,
that's
which I think...
That's not bad, and sometimes simple's good, right?
Dialectic, the direct translation means a conversation. But the difficulty is it's gone through different iterations throughout history. And when Socrates talks about dialectic, it means something different to when Aristotle uses the term dialectic. And then to further complicate things, when you get into modern philosophy, there's Hegelian dialectic, which is almost like this idea that you've got a push-pull between different ideas, and what's in the middle is your final thing, and that is the truth. And then after Hegel, you've got Marx, and you've got materialistic dialectic, material dialectics, which is basically like similar to the Hegelian dialectic, but it only talks about material drivers like economics and physics and things like that. So that's why when you said I looked up a definition of dialectic, I was like, whoa, let's not go there.
Well, it must have been very good, since it was in the stream of the Socratic meeting. So there you go.
I was about to say,
right, nice.
It must have been an old school definition.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I actually made a note for tonight's episode. I don't think we should go there, but I thought it'd be interesting to discuss the Socratic idea of dialectic versus the Marxist version of dialectic in the context of the cave. But it's going to drag it out.
I feel like that's a whole episode on itself, that one.
Yeah, probably.
Well, there was another word that I sort of came across, and you forgive me, I've been just sort of like scanning through my notes to try and find it. It came on a little bit further on there, saying that people were heuristic, and I hadn't sort of come across that before. You know how I love to dig into the meaning of words. And so they were saying that it was somebody who seeks argument aimed at winning rather than the seeking of truth, which I thought was like almost a direct opposite. The dialectic sort of definition.
Yeah.
Good segue, bro. Because this is the bit I was referring to right at the start that I thought maybe I should apply to myself. But yeah, Socrates does bring up that, and this is why we shouldn't throw the youth into philosophy. He says we want them to go through all these other stages of learning first. We want them to have that life experience, then hit the dialectic, and then go back and get a job, and then come out and become a leader. But he says, this is interesting. He says the reason for this is that when you teach the young this idea of dialectic, they just want to use it to prove other people wrong. And what will happen is they'll prove other people wrong, and other people will prove them wrong, and then they'll basically reach this stage of skepticism where they're like, well, I don't know what's true. Sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong. Who knows what's true? And then they throw philosophy out the window, or they use philosophy as basically just, I'm just going to use it to prove whatever, which is, I think, that word that you're describing. What was it? Heuristic or something? Or
heuristic.
Heuristic, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're talking about. Just saying that they're going to argue everything, and by doing so, they lose sight of what they should be going after, which is truth. But
that's right. What is he? He refers to them as puppies. You know how puppies just want to tear everything apart.
Yeah. They get their first taste of blood, and then they want to tear everything apart.
I like that analogy. It was really good.
Yeah, so the reason I had a chuckle at that is because, like, I'm walking around during the week and I'm like, the particular versus the truth. And then someone will say something and I'm like, you're just focused on the particular, man. And then I'm like, oh, hang on. Am I just a puppy?
You're just a puppy.
I just want to use this to prove people wrong.
See, I grew up like the oppositional defiance disorder is strong in my gene pool. And we love arguing for the sake of the argument, and even my mum, we'd be arguing sometimes. I'd just keep talking back, and she'd hold up, maybe 3 fingers and go, "How many fingers am I holding up?" And even that, I'd try and argue, like, no, 4, and even though she's holding up 3, because you're still holding your hand up, and there's a 4th finger there and a thumb, and she'd be like, "It's 3."
So he's right,
3.
isn't he?
It's just 3. And thank God I didn't have dialectic in my tool belt. Well, my poor mother would have been, oh my God. So
she would have held up those fingers and you would have gone straight to book 7.
Yeah.
And you would have been like,
well, that's one finger, but they're all fingers. What is a finger?
Fingers or are they tentacles?
Yeah.
I think she might have been giving you one finger at that point in time.
That's my mum would never give me the finger. But she probably would have got cranky, that's for sure. But
frustration would be strong.
So I think he's right on point. Like, strangely, I've turned 40 this year, and this is maybe in the last 6 months I'm learning, like at work, to not fight every battle.
Yeah.
And in my marriage, I've maybe learnt that 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, and even only recently, maybe in the last 2 months. So here's a funny story, which is a direct result of this book. I was having an argument with my wife a few weeks ago, and I realised partway through the argument that I'd been a bit of a jerk and I was wrong. And I just started laughing. and I could see it really threw my wife for 6, poor thing, because she had no idea why I was laughing. And I just started laughing. I just realised I was wrong. I just realised that I've been an idiot. I'm sorry. And it was this book that just taught me to, like, no, you're wrong. Like, just stop being a goose and just let it go. And just admit that no, actually, I was wrong about that. And,
funny, it's something like,
middle aged. I think he's onto something with these age periods, which we'll explore.
In his time frames are spot on.
Well, I think so. He's like, learn it at 35 or 30. Learn it at 30, and then at 35, go back to work, and stay there for another 15 years.
Yeah, that's true. He's like, until you're 50,
and then when you're 50.
50.
Okay, then you can come out and play with the dialectic.
Well, actually, he says if they survive until they're 50.
Yeah. Well, they are warriors too, I suppose.
That's right.
Well, yeah, the survival rate probably wasn't as good as it is now. But yeah, I thought that was funny too, Ruben, that if they survive moment. But anyway, so you've got to be 50.
Before you can be a leader, but you got to be 30 before you learn dialectic.
It's, you know, it actually does make some sense when you think about it. Because when I think about myself, and I wouldn't talk down to anyone younger than me, absolutely, because everyone goes through different stages of life. But I think up until I was 30, probably my understanding of the world was pretty narrow. And, you know, it's like you're sort of pointing out, there's a certain amount of life experience that broadens your horizons a bit. And, you know, those moments when you do realize you're wrong and maybe you need to change your tact a little bit. But I think he's not too bad with his time frames he's got there. I'd be really curious to see, you know, now with me at 40, and then looking back in 10 years to think about, you know, maybe how much I've learned between 40 and 50, and you know, maybe still thinking I had a long way to go, you know, when I think about myself looking back at 30 now, you know what I mean? I mean, that's life though, right? You're always learning. Yeah.
If we keep working on Socratic dialogues, we'll still be working on Socrates by the time you hit that point.
It should be.
Yeah, 100%.
No, I think I agree totally with you guys. Yeah, I reckon, although I wouldn't even say 30, I'd say maybe it wasn't, maybe I'm being too hard on myself, but I reckon it wasn't until I was 35 until I actually started thinking.
Doesn't that align with the part of the male brain that can interpret risk? I remember reading something about that it's like in your 30s is when you start to actually have the mature brain as a man. It comes into play earlier for the ladies. Yeah, as usual, the men lag behind with that.
I don't know what the time frames are, but you're right. But that's what they reckon. Yeah.
It's like all those memes that they sort of show about, why men don't live as long as women. And they show these like dumb things that we're doing, like like hold my beer, like that. That's just like the sentiment of dumb stuff that dudes do.
Yeah, the hold my beer is hilarious. All those types of memes. So, all right, well, let's keep going. So we're up to we're almost at the end.
Well, so basically, we should say, sorry, when they sort of hit 50 and they're, basically going back into putting service back into the state, right? That's what they're doing, because they've, you know, had that life experience, they've had the dialectic education, all that sort of thing. Now they're putting it all, that's everything they've learned in their life, now they're putting into practice in the running of the state. And that's that sort of core concept of bringing them back in at that point. And that, you know, once they've lived a virtuous life and, maintain the ideals of the state, then they, I don't know, get a state funeral or something like that and being held in high esteem as such as like a, I don't know, like famous general or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You'd be given the highest honors that the society can bestow on you, because that's in the Socratic universe, the highest achievement that you could sort of possibly have is that now you're a philosopher. After a life of hard toil, you've attained the rank and, maintained our perfect society. And
just on that, at the end there, Socrates the feminist appears again.
Yes, indeed.
Yep.
So he goes, you. So he's like, oh, what do you think of these? And he's like, oh, you are a sculptor, Socrates. You have made statues of our governors faultless in beauty. He goes, yes. I said, Glaucon, and of our governesses too. For you must not suppose that what I've been saying applies to men only, and not to women as far as their natures can go. Right, you are. There you are right, since we have made them to share in all things like the men. So, I thought that was funny.
Yeah,
but there's still that little jab that Socrates puts in the end of that sentence there. Yeah. So let me read that again. So, yes, I said, Glaucon, and of our governesses too. For you must not suppose that what I've been saying applies to men only, and not to women, as far as their natures go. I'm like, whoa! So he's like, straight away, feminist, Jerk.
I was about to say, I don't know why we don't hear more feminists quoting Socrates, but you're right. Maybe it's that little jab at the end. That
I think it's a little jab at the end. He's still like, within reason. I'm like, oh man.
Yeah.
It's 2,500 years ago. I mean, we can't cancel the guy for that.
Yeah.
Well, particularly when he's right.
Whoa! Whoa! Wow!
You may direct all mail and complaints to
Big Rubes.
Yeah.
Big Rubes at hotmail.com.
Come at me.
Oh gosh. Anyway, and we crept into chapter 8 because
I reckon
it flowed just a little bit longer, didn't it?
Yeah, but I think chapter 8 can function as a
Yeah.
kicking off point next week, so we can just leave it there if you want.
I think so. Sorry, go. Yeah.
I was just going to say, just before we get on there, I don't know if you guys noticed, there's like a little paragraph right as I was sort of wrapping up the end of chapter 7 that I had to have a chuckle at. They're talking about how they were going to make this proceed and sort of come into fruition, this state then.
This is pretty bad. This is pretty bad. No, go.
Go for
I
it.
forgot about this. This is bad.
Well, I don't have the full quote there, but it was just something like, we'll just send all of the inhabitants, out of the state, and anyone who's over 10 years old, and we'll keep their children, and we'll teach them the way of the state, and that way we'll just get the changes to happen as quickly as possible, then everyone will be happy.
Basically, like, how are we going to make this work? Yeah, easy. We'll just kidnap all the 10-year-olds and we'll indoctrinate them, and we'll be fine.
Unrelated. Well, kind of related. Last night I watched the newish Black Widow movie, and spoiler alert. That's kind of what happens in that. Is they grab all these girls who are like 4 to 8 or 4 to 10 years old and train them in this new assassination mentality. So it's kind of the same thing. It's just grab the kids and mold the soft little minds into this new way of living, and away they go. So
yeah.
Well, I mean, it's kind of what both the Nazis and the communists tried to do. I mean, they didn't kidnap the kids, but they did try to take some real strict actions in what they do with the education of children. So, I mean,
maybe
they were taking a page. Maybe they're taking a page from Plato.
Look, it would make complete sense, right? Because you think about the Republic, and like that's exactly what you would have had these dictators thinking about: is how am I going to establish my republic? They might have had some differing opinions on what that's going to look like at the end and what the ultimate happiness might be. But
and Hitler's playbook was basically the same book that Caesar used. Like when you look at it, the moves were actually very similar. So all right, well, let's quickly mosey on to the pub Philosophers.
Sure.
Here it is on our screen, and the jingle will be playing post-production. Alright, so the pub Philosophers, without notice, the topic for today is a parenting question. History, at what point... So I've made a decision. Over the coming months, I'm going to show my son the World War II in colour documentary. I'm going to start showing him history because my concern is there's a lot of things that get discussed in high school, and without having an understanding of the events of the Great Wars and different times in the last 100 to 200 years, it's going to seem a bit odd, or it has opportunity to be misunderstood. And the reason I got to there was, I think you guys remember, we went to a musical not that long ago where they were talking about what happened when 9/11 happened. And I noticed there were kids in the audience watching this musical, and it occurred to me that if my kids were there, they don't have the context of the event of 9/11 itself. So they're watching a play of the impact of 9/11 happening to all these different people, and particularly one of the characters in the play was a Muslim person who was peaceful and a nice guy and all those things, but how his life changed as a result of 9/11. but no context of actually what was 9/11, what happened. And it
Mm.
occurred to me, kids watching that could take away the complete wrong message because they're missing the context of that event. So I
Right.
thought, okay, I've got to make sure that when my kids go to high school and start learning about these grown-up ideas, that they have the context. So if they see someone say, "Oh, that person's a Nazi," what does that actually mean? What were the Nazis really? And what was that war? And that's just an example. But
Mm.
so I'm going to do the whole let's watch the World War II in color, and then work through some other history as well, not just war, but some other history.
Are you worried that the curriculum is just going to be too revisionist and gloss over stuff, or?
Not necessarily. I hadn't really thought about that, to be honest, but it's more just context. I think I'd rather like the I remember seeing on my old computer, my 486 back in the day, the blimp disaster that caught on fire, and the news
I
presenter
remember what
going
name did
the humanity, the humanity. I remember watching that with my parents next to me, and they were able to explain to me what happened, and that this happened, and that's why I'm saying this, and so I remember then when I saw that example at school, I already knew about it. It didn't shock me to like, oh, why haven't I been told about this? And
Mm.
I felt better prepared. I don't know. Like I'm
Yeah.
just. So what do you think? I mean, I'll start with you, Lachlan. How much? Like, have you gone into any of those types of sort of dark side of humanity topics with your kids at this point in time?
Yeah, well, sort of, but maybe not that dark, but certainly like concepts of um, politics, economies, and the reality of, I don't know, that people aren't always out for the betterment of everybody else. Sometimes they're out for the betterment of themselves and at the sacrifice of others. Um,
Hmm.
we talk about some. It's funny. It's a time when my son and I. This is my eldest son, I should say, because he's 11. It's a similar age, and I guess when we're in the car on the way to like soccer training or something, it just tends to be him and I in the car. We often talk about really uh, somewhat adult concepts. It's quite funny. That just seems to be a time when we talk about stuff. I haven't thought too much about going over history and stuff, but we certainly talk about real shit though. we
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
get into it sometimes, and I know we were talking just in the car about um, God, what was it? Designed obsolescence, and like that people would design things to break on purpose, so you have to buy another one, right? And he was like
Ah.
struggling to get his head around the concept, and he's like, "That's no, they're like ripping people off. And it's like really bad for the environment, and it's this, and it's wasteful." And I was like, "Yes, it's all of these things, And but we talked about why people do it and that it really sort of exists, and but like just that's
Mm.
just one sort of example. But we'll do that about politics or whatever else. So yeah, look, I guess I do it. I don't know. We always had like discussions like that when I was a kid, and particularly when my grandfather was around or something. We'd finish dinner and we'd talk about politics or what was happening in the world. And I don't know. I was always privy to pretty adult, important, I think, discussions and stuff as part of our family when I was younger. And so I suppose I'd do the same with my son as well.
Yeah. Okay. How about you,
Yeah.
Ruben? What do you think?
Yeah, mate, I have no idea how to tackle that, to be quite honest. I do the best I can with my boys. Although Lachlan just touched on something that's really interesting. I still remember when I was a child, really being interested in involving myself in adult conversations. So when my parents would have friends over, they'd have deep conversations. And I don't mean participating, but I mean listening to. And I remember that being something that I really enjoyed. I actually
Mm.
remember going to my parents at some point and going, I enjoy discussion. I think that's what I like doing.
Okay.
Um, Took me till we started this podcast to actually do it, but it's actually, I mean, that's actually something that I enjoy. So I don't know whether my boys are going to be like that, I don't really know how to play it out for them. And to be quite honest, I don't really know how to tackle the history question either. So you're getting a lot of I don't knows from me tonight.
That's all right.
Although it did occur to me not that long ago that one of the things that worries me is once I'm gone, are my kids going to have the skill set to analyze and understand what is right and wrong? And so that's something that I think about a lot. And that to me is more important than whether they know history or whether they know philosophy or whether they know religion. I want them to be able to do that. I don't know the best way to do that. I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, I want to watch some of this history with them, because they'll see how bad it can get, and I'd rather them discover that with me sitting right there with my arm around them, saying that happened and that could happen again, and that's why it's important that we are slow to anger, and why we have forgiveness, and why we have our morality that we have, and don't take for granted these things. So I'd rather be part of that journey of them discovering how messed up humankind actually can be, and provide some support. I don't know.
Yeah, me too, mate. No, I agree 100%. It's a question of the best way to do that. I think that's not a bad idea, watching a documentary like that, because say what you will about the process of learning what's right and wrong, that's not a bad way to at least open up the discussion.
Yeah. For some reason I got this vision in my head of, I don't know if you remember that movie, The Fifth Element. And
good movie.
Yeah. And you had Lilu, who is this sort of spiritual being or whatever, and she's trying to understand humanity, and she's looking through all the atrocities of humankind, and she can't understand why she should try and save humanity with all the horror that's been before her. And just her genuine anguish at seeing it and understanding it. So like, you can understand why, or I can understand why you want to try and shepherd him through, because it's tough stuff. And it's important that humanity knows the lessons and learns the lessons from the price that these people have paid, because history will repeat itself if people forget the lessons. So it is important people know about it and they understand the cost.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if history doesn't repeat itself, it certainly rhymes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was a good pub session.
Yeah, man.
All right, well, we'll wrap it up there. To those listening, thanks for listening. You can find us on many different podcast networks, as well as on the YouTubes, and you can find us at our website at therepublicofmam.com. And thanks for listening. We'll catch you guys next time. And remember, the Republic